Hi, I'm Thom Ruhe of the Kauffman Foundation, and welcome to Top of Mind, a series of discussions and topics that hopefully impact the world of entrepreneurship. Today I'm going to talk about a couple of topics. Immigration, that's kind of a hot button in this election season, and what it means to the world of entrepreneurship. Manufacturing. Did you know that we have a serious problem with unfilled jobs in this country? From there, we're going to slip on into the field of healthcare, see what's happening around the horn there, and then we're going to wrap it up with what's happening on college campuses to help entrepreneurs, or at least students, that want to find their way into entrepreneurship. So, apparently, we're in an election year. You might have guessed by the things you're seeing on TV and the commercials that are out there. And, a tried and true campaign topic is one that really gets a lot of people hot and bothered is immigration. And, this notion that immigrants may be coming into this country, to take our jobs. This is an area that's well documented by the foundation. We've done a lot of research in this field and in fact what immigrants do for the economy here. But for the people that want to be paranoid about it, I came across something that was really fascinating to me. It was a blog post here on Science Blog, and I think it's the good people over at Johns Hopkins behind this. But they found here, incredibly, that children born in foreign countries are the best students, and later in life, the more successful adults. So, one has to wonder, especially in the context of the types of things that we fund and the research we have found, is there a correlation to that? Well, if you want to consider following an entrepreneurial path or an arc to the life of a child into adulthood, there's a lot of corollary data that would bear that out. We have found through our own index of entrepreneurial activity, specifically from 1996 to 2011, the most successful young adults are those of immigrant-born families. They have a much higher rate of starting and launching new companies. They have a higher success rate among the companies that they do start. And, why is this important to have a discussion around this? It's simply a matter of dealing with facts over emotion. Immigration, especially in our economy, is one of those topics that are so emotionally charged. The rhetoric sometimes drowns out the reality. And that is that the American dream is very much alive in this country, but it's being seen and felt more through the lens of the immigrants that come to this country. They have the connection with the entrepreneurial spirit upon which we were born. And they embrace that spirit, they work towards that spirit, and they are, in fact, on a net basis, actually quite a catalyst for job growth in this country. Now think about what I just said. They're generating jobs in this country. Now correlate that to the last stump speech that you heard where this came up, where this kind of xenophobic notion of some sort of negative impact to the country is happening through immigration. When in fact, if we had our druthers here at the Kauffman Foundation, we would take every, bright foreign exchange student that's graduating from one of our world-class universities with an advanced degree, and some high percentage of them are actually with an idea worthy of starting a company. We would take every one of those and staple a green card to their diploma. If you want to affect top-line revenue, in this country, if you want to affect top-line job growth in this country, we should be embracing the types of things and activities and groups of people that go ahead and create those jobs. So think about that the next time you're seeing a political ad about that. So, speaking of jobs, I don't know how many people are aware of the fact, but, unemployment is still a big issue in this country, yet by varying standards, there are hundreds of thousands, if not a couple million jobs. I think the range actually is, by some estimates, as low as 600,000, and by other estimates as high as 2.4 million jobs that are going unfilled. That is to say that somebody, an employer somewhere, has a job opening but cannot find a qualified applicant for that job. And a great number of them are in what are referred to as kind of the skilled trades area. And by skilled trades, we're talking about, welding, HVAC, mold, tool and die makers, folks that obviously make a living with their hands, but in a way that adds value. In other words, beyond just, working on an assembly line where you need some sort of skill on top of that. And, there's a tremendous opportunity here for that. And, I remember once reading a really good book on this subject, From Shop Class to Soul Craft. The author eludes me at the moment, but he did a really good job in making the case of why we're at that situation in the country. And, at the risk of a spoiler alert, the arc of the story kind of goes that starting back in the late 70s and early 80s, already through high school, public education went down two tracks. And what was kind of always known and dubbed as college prep was the type of, let's say, academic preparation for the service industries or the professional services, the white-collar jobs, if you will, right? And somehow there was this notion that, the vocational arts was more aligned for the types of kids that just we thought through self-selection, right or wrong, might not be able to, track into a white-collar career path, and instead were better prepared or better suited for blue-collar. And so what happened with that is that kind of an unintended consequence of this bifurcation in public education was school systems started de-investing in vocational training. There were less and less shop classes. I think about in my own life in this, my three kids, I think there was a little bit of home ec that at least my daughters went through. I'd make the argument that my son probably should have too, side note. But, the shop classes of my time, they by and large don't even exist anymore. So fast forward to the here and now. Fast forward to this notion of outsourcing and how bad that is. You can't outsource someone to come to your home and install a gas line so that you can, turn on those beautiful new gas-burning fire logs in your fireplace. You can't outsource a technician to come in and install a new compressor for your air conditioning. And so, we're not getting any smaller as a country. We're not, the population continues to grow. As we enjoy higher quality of life, these certain things that required these skilled trades continue to grow, yet the feeder system, namely young people going into those fields, has shrunk. There's a certain irony here, and I'll tell you another reference source. If anybody's familiar with Mike Rowe, he's the dirty jobs guy. He's done a great job to elevate the visibility around this subject. And if you Google Mike Rowe's Senate testimony, he actually went to the Senate and they had a hearing where he testified on this. And he points out in a very eloquent way that this is going to continue to be a problem for society. And, I think I struggle, as a parent, as a member of my community anymore, not to say to the young people coming up, consider going forth into one of these areas. I don't know that I would say necessarily go forth and, get that Ivy League education, graduate, $100,000 in debt, whereas you might want to go off and become, the next great welder. And that too has me thinking, because, the one side of this, it's great to understand that there's a need there, and it's going to be there for the foreseeable future. And it's great to be in demand. But you know what's better than being in demand? Being in control. And so, from the Kauffman Foundation's perspective, the nuance to this conversation that I would add to it is, for everybody that's considering a career in those skilled trade, the vocational arts, for those of you who might think of that as a viable career option, the good news is you can find jobs there. And again, as I said, by varying estimates, upwards of a couple million vacancies in those fields. But I would challenge you to consider a slight bend of that and approach that opportunity that's out there, that demand that's out there, as an entrepreneur. And what I mean by that is incorporate yourself. Have a vehicle in which companies can purchase your services, your time. If you take a relationship that's exclusively limited to that of an employee, you will only make as much as you get paid per hour for the number of hours you put in for your employer. If, however, you provide a service as a value add to those companies that need those employees, you have the opportunity to leverage a greater return for yourself. You can bill by the job. And that's important when the unit of labor you provide is how you're measured and how you're paid. And what it does on the employment model is it undervalues varying levels of skill. What do I mean by that? Here's what I mean by that. Let's say I am a very skilled welder, and I can do in an hour's time what takes another welder 3 hours to do. In that capacity, I could actually be penalized by being a more efficient, a better worker. If, however, I got paid by the job, and I can do a job in less time than somebody else can do that job, I can still extract payment for that level, but do it for less time, ergo I can go to the next job. The key in professional services to how you can turn what would be a normal job opportunity into a business opportunity is when you get to a point where you can start leveraging the labor of others. At that point, what you start doing is charging for and benefiting from the hours that others put in on your behalf. So, you know, I don't want to beat a dead horse on that, but I do want to challenge those of you that are going to hopefully have a happy and prosperous career in the skilled trades to think of it a little differently and consider, you know, the entrepreneurial path as a variation to surviving in that marketplace. You know, clearly manufacturing is going through a disruptive process with this skill gap. It's going to redefine, you know, how it attracts and retains talent in that space. All right, so I already mentioned how manufacturing is going to be disrupted about this. You know, when we think of at the foundation disruption, and there's plenty of economist terms for it. One of the ones we'll banter about here all the time is creative destruction, right? Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction. You know, this is where, you know, some industry is just so staid in its process, it's so entrenched in the way of doing things. Something comes completely from outside and disintermediates, it disrupts, you know, what's happening there. And, you know, when I think about the internet and how it's disrupted, you know, so many technologies, I mean, you know, right top of mind, you've got music, you know, newspapers, books. Another one that's just rife and ready, and it's certainly also in the public discourse right now, is healthcare. Healthcare is clearly an area that's just ready to be disrupted through entrepreneurship. Startups, you know, in this space are just, they're really going to be a way to change the dialogue of how we do this. And I'm not getting into the whole mess and nuance of the Affordable Care Act, probably better known to some of you as Obamacare. Again, I'm not going to care, we're purple on how you describe it. But clearly, when we're spending, it says here, $7,600 a year on health care, you know, and 1 in 2 Americans has a chronic disease and waits to see a doctor in a metropolitan city is, you know, growing. Something has to change here. We spend order of magnitude higher on a per capita basis in healthcare than any other nation in the world. Yet we're nowhere near the top in, you know, patient outcomes. That is like the perfect storm for entrepreneurs to come in. That is the perfect setting for problem, you know, seeking solution with a commercial interest in between. So for those of you who are inclined to go find areas that you can, you know, make a difference, you know, the healthcare space is just ripe for the picking. And I really would encourage you to go fishing there sooner rather than later, because clearly we're not getting any healthier waiting for solutions. So, as is the case with so many other industries, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, and the healthcare space is definitely no different. You know, the advances in technology and the incentives to improve, you know, patient outcomes are very significantly there to drive this type of innovation. You know, examples are everywhere. Here's, you know, a company, Airstrip Technologies, based out of San Antonio, you know, Texas. They've got a very creative application that takes any kind of bedside piece of equipment in a hospital setting. Think of it as a EKG machine, a ventilator, fetal heart monitor, for example, and it tethers it to a smartphone application. So, you know, gone can be the days where, you know, a nurse will have to be sent remotely into a room, you know, take readings to understand, report up through, you know, either a paging system or a phone system to a doctor that may be somewhere remote to even find out. I can now just use, you know, the app for that and see how that's going. You know, again, this was born from an obstetrician, you know, Dr. Cameron Powell, and, you know, he understood that this was a kind of even a lifestyle improvement for doctors. You know, another one would be, you know, ClickCare out of New York, that really speeds up the collaboration between physicians when it comes to diagnosing, you know, a patient. Diagnostics and preventative care, I should say, as an aside here, that's going to be a big area for this type of improvement. You know, as bandwidth becomes more pervasive, and I mean, you know, higher bandwidth. I alluded to that in a previous session where we talked about things like Google Fiber impacting, you know, communities. The ability to transmit larger blocks of data for the purposes of diagnostics and treatment will have significant improvement in patient outcomes in this space. You know, there's certainly regulatory hurdles that have to come along and be, you know, knocked down, and we definitely need, you know, the government to become a partner to understand that, you know, things that are put in place for good reasons, for reasons that, you know, protect patient confidentiality and you know, and other very worthy reasons, need to be looked at for also how they might, however, impede progress in these areas. So I have no doubt in the entrepreneurial spirit that we'll overcome those. I'm very hopeful, you know, that the overall outcome for society is improving patient care, and it's going to be done in an entrepreneurial way. So let's hope, as we improve, you know, patient outcomes and healthcare results in the country, that we continue to have a healthy and growing population. So that takes me to that growing population. That means the young folks, the greatest natural resource we have in the country. And, you know, I'm talking to you, the college students out there. You know, one of the things we are really always trying to come up with are reasons to put people into an opportunity or situation that allows them to kind of try out their entrepreneurial chops. You know, gives them the ability to consider and dabble in entrepreneurship. And, you know, I think if there were a time in your life where you really are open and able to take risk, you know, your college years kind of feel like that. I mean, it certainly was for me, for at least the years that I can remember. And so with that in mind, I wanted to bring attention to a top 10 list, and the top 10 reasons every college student should intern, or at least try to intern, at a startup. So I'm not going to be a David Letterman. I don't have his skill or money, but I'm going to do my best here, and we're going to start with number one reason. They're close to your age. You know, obviously, if you're jumping into a startup on your campus, you're not dealing with a lot of old fogies like me, but you're going to be in a good peer group there. You know, there's great networking and travel opportunities. You get to stay in hostels. You can flop on a lot of couches because, you know, money is so lean, but you get to meet a lot of people doing that, and you get to see some really cool places. There's constant inspiration. You know, for too many, for too long, I think the aspiration was a big paying job over, you know, on Wall Street, and I think we kind of saw where that could lead, you know, the country. And I think there's been a positive thing that's happened since like the 2008 crash, is this notion of finding something that really inspires me and kind of gives back. And, you know, I got to tell you, I've been in startups, serial entrepreneur in that capacity. to me, there's nothing more inspirational than being in a startup. Boy, those coffee-fueled days and nights of just, riffing on ideas and throwing things up against the wall to see what sticks. It just, it's chicken soup for your soul. It really is something that I think will pay a good dividend that, you'll be thinking back years from now on and saying, those were some really good days in my life. Anyhow, I don't want to wax nostalgic for too long. The next reason, hands-on experience, right? How many times you try to go get a job and you're in that catch-22 loop, right? You don't have experience, so we can't hire you. Well, if you hired me, I'd get some experience. Go make your experience. Make it in a startup. Even if it's not something you pursue for the rest of your life, at least you go to your next employer or your first employer, and, they don't need to know whether or not the company you worked at was a startup or if they even recognize the name. The fact is you have something that distinguishes yourself from others. So, the hands-on experience and the responsibility you get with that. Another little known thing about startups are you probably get a lot more responsibility that you would do in any other established company that early in your experience or tenure there. It's informal and flexible atmosphere. I mean, this is true for 99% of them out there. I'm sure there are some startups in, securities or, other fields that are highly regulated that are probably a little more buttoned down. But for the most part, I think it's a pretty informal and flexible environment. The sixth item here on the list, they actually listen to you. What a novel idea. We all like to be heard. And I think in the notion and environment of a startup is there isn't a whole lot of people. So the ones that are there, their opinion matters. And you really can have an impact by speaking up and finding your confidence, finding your voice. And it's just, again, one of those things that will serve you well in your life, whether whatever path you choose to take. Well, they also want to grow with you. Small size mean they know the importance of every employee. It's tangential to what I just said about listening to you, but there is a esprit de corps, a camaraderie that's built. I had in my own experience a company that we started very humbly, and certainly not by design, but the day was forced upon us. But it was actually born on 9/11. And like I said, that was not a day we picked. September 10th, the day before, was like any other day. And the day that was going to follow should have been like any other day. But it wasn't. The world changed forever. And the six of us that went off and started a company on that day, I'm happy to say we survived it. A lot of other companies didn't. Startups, that was a tough time to be in a startup. But those of us, who made it through, and as we grew that company, and years later, that core group of us, that was a special moment in time that none of us will ever forget. It shaped us as who we were, and it meant something to us as a team. And I was thrilled that every one of those six made the ride for those years with us. They say that the hotter the fire, the stronger the steel. It definitely implies. And startup environment will test your steel. But if you make it through the test, the ride will be worth it. So, what else? Bureaucracy. No bureaucracy. Everyone is equal. You don't stand for staff meeting on top of staff meeting if there's only 4 of you to staff. And that's just an operational efficiency of startups. There's a couple other fun ones in there. A lot of places have free food, or, you have, you can bring your pet into work. Pants optional Fridays. I'm not sure about that one. We tried that once upon a time. That didn't work so well. But my point to say, in kind of wrapping up that list, is, startups will give you the opportunity to have more personality and cater more to the personality of the team members. And that's important because you'll invest a lot of time, treasure and talent into a startup. And you want to know that you're doing it with people that share your values. And that's reflected in the way you treat each other, the culture you'll build there. And that could be, as I said earlier, very rewarding. At some point when you're successful and you can stand back and look at that, you can realize that you had something there to do. And I would just wrap up by saying, again, from my own experience, one of the things that I had this quirky little habit of doing in that company that we started on 9/11, I'd invariably have to go out and make a sales call, and when I'd come back to the parking lot, I would just sit in the parking lot for a moment, and I'd look around, and I'd count the cars that I saw in the parking lot. And I always marveled at the growing number of cars in the parking lot, because those were our employees. And behind every one of those cars was a family, with somebody making a house payment, it was somebody paying a mortgage. In short, every one of those jobs helped grow the economy. And why is that important? That's why we have that right over there. E equals R. Entrepreneurship equals recovery. At a time where the economy is still struggling from the effects of the 2008 crash and all the loss of liquidity and destruction of wealth, it's going to be entrepreneurs that are rebuilding the economy, rebuilding a wealth that was lost, frankly, rebuilding a future that's worth living. So find your way in that world. I promise you, if you do, you won't regret it. So that's my pitch for this week. Please join us next week. We'll share other stories from the world of entrepreneurship, simply anything that comes top of mind.